Why not have one and just share it?
Hi,
We could do that too.
Tynan.
Everyone likes their own note taker, probably.
Yeah, because then
You
you
have a
can
different flavor.
do what you will with it, right? How's everyone doing today? If folks want to drop in the chat and just say hi, maybe where you're from, and yeah, if you're feeling away today, you want to drop that in, that would be nice as well. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Just gonna let people join. I love how prompt people are. We even had two people RSVP a little while ago that they couldn't come, and I was like, this never happens with events. Everyone just bails. They just flake. So I think we've got a conscientious crew, which is really nice.
It's the
Bill
nature
from,
of the beast that you're shepherding.
yes, it's nice. I like that, shepherding a beast. How's it going, Jack?
Was that to me?
Yeah, that's you.
Well, I'm not dead yet.
There you go. Okay, we've got a little bit of an international crowd. We've got Montreal, Arkansas, Zurich, Chicagoland. I used to live in Chicago. I always thought it was funny that they called it Chicagoland. It sounds like an amusement park or something. Oh, Maine. Interesting. Currently in Buenos Aires, though. If you want to
Yeah,
post
where I went
drive.
to high school, they call the Michiana area. So it's like that little band of things between Michigan and Indiana. So it's like its own little identity, cross border. So it's
British,
similar to Chicagoland.
yeah. British Columbia. Okay. Who has snow right now? Cambridge, Connecticut, Seattle. Oh my gosh. Okay, Mark Antoine has snow.
We had a
We don't.
dusting here.
Yeah, that's what Rajesh was saying. Okay, we got a few people from Boston, Oakland. Fun. Boulder. Boulder got dumped on, didn't it? My mom just sent a picture. SoCal cold. Yeah, I think for those of us who are used to being in warmer climates, the winter, like it's 50 here right now in Austin, and I'm freezing. But to be fair, the place where I'm taking this call does not have any heat, so I have a little local space heater. All right. Fun. I miss snow.
I do too.
Lovely.
I haven't even been living in Austin for that long, but I miss it already.
Yeah, this is what happens. Okay, I'm just going to invite my note taker because I didn't do that yet, and then we will get started.
Oh, and
Thank
Kristen,
you.
I sent you the link to the stream.
Cool. Do I have to do anything with that?
You want to just post it on the Scenius Blue Sky account or retweet it or something. I don't know
Yeah,
if you have that.
actually, does one of the Scenius members here have access to the blue sky? Maybe Glenn.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I do. I can post it.
All right.
cool.
To the center.
Yeah, it's on my account. I'll send you a link. One sec.
All right, while you're doing that, I am going to tee us up and get us started. So, hi everybody, welcome, and thanks for being here. This is Making Sense of Open Source Ideals, Reality, and What's on the Horizon. I'm Kristen Pavle. I'll be your host today. I'm collaborating with Gabriel Chartier, and he'll be facilitating. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping before we get started, though. So today's event is sponsored by the Sensemaking Scenius, which is a community of practice for digital sense makers. We're over 70 people now, 70 members, builders, researchers, engineers, artists, activists, designers. The main thing that brings us together is that we believe the internet can be a powerful tool for creating a more regenerative, intentional, and meaningful world. So for those members on the call, can you give a little wave or maybe an emoji? Because we've got quite a few members. So you can see that there's quite a few of us here. In our community, members support each other's projects. We meet aligned collaborators and co-founders. We build sense-making tools together. We shape how we're governed as a community, and we host events like this one. It's pretty fluid. We're a very self-organizing bunch, so it's it's kind of fun. I'll drop a link in the chat in a little bit. If you are interested, if this is aligned, we'd love to have you join us or at least reach out. And I think, yeah, I'll drop that chat in. But the only other, or link in the chat, the only other housekeeping that I have is the actual panel and like how things are going to operate today. So for the first hour, Gabriel will be facilitating discussion with our panelists, and I'll be taking questions from the Zoom chat, so feel free to drop things there. We have a kind of like backstage staging area, so Gabriel will be able to pull from those and weave them into conversation. So that's how it'll work for the first hour, but then we will open the stage up where folks can come up and ask their questions or join into conversation with the panelists. Feel free to DM me or just message me in the chat at any point if you have a question or something comes up, and I'll be able to help you there. And yeah, I think my only other note is that all of the panelists, Gabriel and myself, were all Scenius members, and so we're very excited to be hosting and putting this on today. So welcome, welcome, and I will now pass it over to Gabriel.
Awesome. Thanks, Kristen. Yeah, I'm Gabriel Chartier. I'm a web developer and an information architect and a systems designer. And yeah, I've been in the Scenius for a while, and it's a fun, lively group of folks. And we started talking about open source licensing and things like that. And I thought it would be a good idea to throw a panel, and a bunch of the Scenius members, just showed up and wanted to be a part of it. So that's why we're here today. So I'll be moderating the panel, trying to keep it kind of flowing and on track. So the agenda is going to look kind of like this. So we're going to kind of start with like what is like open source, maybe a little bit of like the history and origins and ideals of it, and then we're going to kind of shift to the present of like how does the ideals of open source actually compare and live up to the reality of what we're seeing today. And then we'll kind of turn to the future of open source on the frontier, with like Web3 and AI and all of this stuff. Like, how does that change the picture? And like, what can we do about the problems that open source is facing? And then we'll have the audience Q&A at the end. So that's a bit about the agenda. A bit of ground rules for the discussion. So it's a shared exploration. It's not like a debate or a monologue or anything like that. So just remind the panelists to keep their answers short and to build on each other. So I'll go ahead and introduce the panelists. So first we have Rajesh. He's a common source theorist and practitioner, and a mathematician and cognitive scientist by training. And he's the founder of Strategist, which is an org that creates processes and tools as their products for planetary commons. Erlend is an open product strategist who has written a lot about the complexities of open source. He's the former VP of community at Discourse, and he's working on Rumi, which is a free-form communications playground, and Fishfolk, which is a collection of 2D games. And then we have Regis, who is a yogi, a coach, an athlete, geek, cryptoculture nerd, autist, and polymath, who works at Octant and plays at Gravity DAO. So those are our panelists. So yeah, thank you all for joining, and I'm really excited to have a discussion. So I think we'll start with just a simple, easy question, which is briefly, how do you define open source? And maybe I'll start with Erlend.
Sure. The really simple version of it for me is anything that is a recipe for how you put something together, that's an open source thing. So just like you can have a recipe for food, you put those ingredients together, now you have a particular dish. Just the same way with the houses we build and the code that runs our programs.
Awesome, thanks. And Rajesh or Regis, either of you want to go next?
I'll go
It's a
since
tough
I'm
question.
unmuted. Difficult question. I mean, so I might have used Erlend's recipe metaphor too, but since he has, let me try something else. Um, Open source for me is when your production, whatever is the blueprint or the technique or the process that informs your making whatever you make. It could be code, it could be software, it could be houses, it could be governments, is transparently available to others to be modified and reproduced as they see fit.
Okay. What about you, Regis?
Yeah, I like to make a distinction, as does Richard Stallman, for that matter, about the nature of what open source is doing versus what free software is doing. So open source to me is a kind of developmental methodology, whereas free software is much more about a social or ethical movement. And so I think he might be the face of open source in many people's minds, but at the same time, he sort of assiduously avoids the term open source himself. So it's kind of an interesting thing.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of definitions floating out there. And I mean, Regis, you touched on like the difference between free software and open source. There's also like, FOSS, free and open source software. And like, I guess that's what free software. But yeah, I'm curious what you all think of that distinction. Like, what's the difference? And yeah, like how do they compare and contrast, or are they the same thing? Like, anybody wanna?
Yeah, well, for me, I think it's interesting because if you look at the definition of FOSS, it includes um, and sort of transcends and includes open source in some sense, right? So I actually like that because as a Hindu, not obviously Hindu, but I kind of like the idea that we have, a structural thing that is also kind of radically open on the other end of it, you know. So
Erlend, do you have any thoughts on this? Like how if there's any difference between the two terms or if it even matters?
Yeah, I guess I lean more towards the latter, at least when you're talking to a larger audience, because it's really just us, the nerds, who care about the distinction there. It's like there's a big history, of course, and it matters. And it's an important distinction to us. And we understand that there are these licenses that have these subtle differences to them as well. But to the regular person, open source really just means you have insight into this thing, and it really ends there. Like they don't really care about who can use this, who's excluded, who's not. Is it like universally available to everyone, or are there exceptions? So I'm kind of excited to move further and further away from talking about this distinction of free versus open source. And I know that a lot of FOSS people are kind of excited about that idea too, because they never loved the fact that free software from the very beginning became this confusing thing where, oh, so it's free software. That's awesome. So you just get it for free. That's why I like it. That's great. And it's like, no, it's really about liberties. It's about the freedom you have with the software. And I don't think we're ever going to move past that confusion if we're also staying in the discussion of free software versus open source software as an important distinction that has to be cleared up in every one of these conversations. Because I think a lot of people are ready to move on and just start going, okay, we have all this openly shareable, remixable software out there. Now, how do we manage this together in a way that actually creates this self-sustaining loop rather than, well, where we are right now, where frankly we are still struggling to protect these free, whether free as in beer or as in freedom, assets out there. So I think we're ready for a more mature sort of next step discussion at this point.
Rajesh, did you have something to add? Yeah, go ahead.
Just briefly, I mean, the more we get out of software, and let's say we talk about, I don't know, open source or free, I mean, or open, say, social regulations or laws, right? So if you have an institution whose operating principles are open, that's different from, like, at least it's different from free beer, right? So the fact that I have the authority and the legitimacy to modify or ask for modifications to the constitution of whatever country that I'm part of, that feels more in the direction of freedom than free beer does, right? And maybe one of the things to talk about here is also how much of the free versus open is sort of stuck in our software as the main metaphor for open source.
Yeah, I mean, if like I liked Erlend's definition of open source, where it's just like any recipe where the instructions are just, you can just follow them and end up with the same thing. Like, and that's not just code. Like, it's anything. It's manufactured goods. It's ideas in some sense, and so there's like a lot of really interesting things there. But when it comes to the word open, I always struggle with it because how open is too open, and what does that even mean? Because like if you have something that has value to it and it's an exhaustible resource, you can't just be totally open. There needs to be some kind of boundary or protection or filter to kind of manage, for lack of a better term, the use of that resource, of that commons. But when it comes to things that aren't exhaustible, like maybe it's different. So I'm curious, like today, like with the state of open source, like what does that look like? What does a balanced approach to openness look like? What do y'all think of that?
I guess I can get us started, since I recently wrote a lengthy essay on exactly this subject. My whole point there in this article called Open Source Power was to point out that the reason why we are still struggling as a movement, as an ecosystem of people developing all of our code as open source artifacts, is that we got a little stuck in absolutist thinking about freedom, thinking that it's virtuous to make something that is absolutely free to everyone and therefore doesn't exclude anyone at all. And the people who loved that the most were the biggest corporations in the world. They love the fact that we decided no one whatsoever is going to be excluded from this work that we are sharing with everyone. And they ended up being by far the ones who benefited the most, because when all the code is free, then the ones who own the hardware and run the servers are the ones who actually get to control access to the code and the program that it runs, rather than the ones who made the code. And that's kind of where we're at today, is the biggest companies in the world, Google, Amazon, Microsoft. One of the biggest underlying causes for their great success is all of the open source code that they can run on their servers completely free of charge. And we see all of these open source communities are constantly struggling for survival, even though they are creating all this immense value. And I pointed out this thing about this idea of the commons. And can someone remind me what is the name again of this great Nobel winning
Eleanor Ostrom.
Yeah.
Eleanor Ostrom? Yes. So Eleanor Ostrom, right, is sort of one of the pioneers of um, the commons as a renewed concept in the modern days. And she had these principles of how do you properly govern a commons without it falling apart. And literally the first principle that sort of undergirds all of the rest of them is that you have to define some kind of boundary around your commons. Like if you have this lake that this little town of people are doing their fishing in, and you're kind of all doing it freely and when without restriction, as long as you're part of the village, right? You can't let any company just come in and start deep sea fishing and trolling across the lake. They're gonna take all the fish out, and now the whole ecosystem is dead and it's all over. And we're effectively doing that with our open source code, where while the code itself is replicable for essentially free, our time and attention is not. And also our ability to commercialize our work is not cheaply replicable. And this is something we have just completely relinquished to the corporations and left it in their hands to figure out anything to do with commercialization of our code products. And we're now in this situation where every time these communities need money to sustain themselves, we have to go and ask the corporations, please donate a little bit to our projects so that we can survive, rather than there being something inbuilt in the work we do that says if you are a huge corporation, you actually have to pay back into the community.
Yeah, and that was one of the main points, starting points of the article that Bill nicely attached into the thing there. If you look at GPL usage over like MIT Apache BSD licenses, is completely flipped, you know. So in 2009, it was 72% of licenses were GPL licenses. Now it's 15%. It was completely the opposite way now with MIT and Apache and BSD licenses. So it's like, you know, it's completely gone the other way. And it's like mathematically exact in that way, and so it's a bit terrifying in that sense. But I do feel like there's this old thing that I heard about. You know, it's like first, like the kind of oppression thing that happens is like first a guest, then a host, and then a master. And so like if you take a look at the nature of licenses, when I read those three layers of licenses, that's what I see exactly. First you're a guest, and then you have to do everything according to these rules and share with everybody. Oh, well, let's make this other thing. So now I'm hosting, and now I can just take whatever I want. And then the other is, not only am I taking whatever I want, I'm now able to shut you out of it, you know, at the end. And so I do think as part of the open source movement, we actually need to think about the license creep, or I don't even know really what to call it, but like preventative measures or something to you know, create a kind of boundary layer there against the inevitable freemium model that seems to exist today.
I don't have something to add, but I want to respond or maybe probe Erlend a little bit. I feel like, you know, open source went from something that a few nerds in a, you know, in Cambridge and a couple other places were hacking away to something that is the foundation of, you know, today's civilization, right? I mean, it's a very short period of time. I mean, let's say 1980 to 2020. I mean, it's less than 50 years. So given that all these complexities had been introduced, you know, I mean, it wasn't, let's say that there was an ideal or a shining city on the hill that was there in the original imagination, but that's not what we are in today, right? And you point out that corporations should be treated differently. I mean, you know, the giant trawler should be treated differently from the fisherman with a rod. But there might be other players too. And there are state players, there are all kinds of small companies. People are using open source to essentially get jobs, right? So it's a resume building exercise. So how do we govern open source for the real world that we are in, as opposed to the ideal world that might have, motivated the original impulse?
Right. Well, my very simple thesis is that developers, and by that I mean developers in the widest possible term, not just programmers, but anyone developing software or digital artifacts that we are sharing openly, we have to be willing to just make and take more power for ourselves. I think because we have had it pretty nice. We've been very comfortable. We've taken jobs at Google, etc. We just played ping pong and drank kombucha and felt like we had made it. Like we sort of were in a position that we enjoyed. We neglected what was going on around us. We hadn't really realized that we had become part of an elite and we had become part of, frankly, the extractive class. That's what we've been doing. And we didn't really continue to scrutinize the system the way we started off in the beginning, where we were kind of the countercultural punks who were doing things differently and doing this radical thing of sharing our stuff openly. But there was a page 2 and 3 and many more onwards from there that we were supposed to continue in this story, and we just sort of let it go by saying like, I'm very comfortable where I am. I'm happy to just share it all freely because that seems to be working, because at least it's working for me. But what we didn't do is to consider open source as part of a wider labor movement. That's kind of where the United States, for example, workforce is at today, is suddenly there's a lot of unions starting to form even in tech, which wasn't the case before because again, they were so comfortable. They figured I'm so well paid and Google is going to be around for forever, and I'm going to be in this job forever. So why bother? Why shake the boat? And suddenly now the power position looks very different. The companies have extracted even more for themselves and don't need as many workers any longer, and the economy is changing. And if we had built a movement where individual developers had more individual power for themselves because of each piece of software that they had made, and they actually retained some ownership over it, then we would have a much more powerful movement with distributed power across the whole stack, because every single developer would be sitting there with this actual license in their hand saying, well, I don't like the way this company is doing things any longer. I'm actually going to change the terms now for this company, as in like these companies of a certain size, for instance, or companies acting in a certain way. You can change the rules, but we gave up that power to change the rules when we accepted these licenses that just said free for everyone forever. And I think that was a crucial mistake. We did kind of the classic thing that developers do, which is that we saw this very simple idea, right? Like free for everyone is a very simple, beautiful thing. So it seems like such a nice principle. And that's what we love to do as technical people, as we go for the simplicity. We seek that out, and that's generally a beautiful thing. But when it comes to the real messy world, it's rarely that simple. And I think that has really come back to bite us.
Does this bring anything up for you, Regis? Anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, as part of my work in Gravity DAO, I sit at the nexus of conflict, right? And so I actually see this kind of idealism biting people in the butt. And I've done a story of, I've done historical studies of how this exact thing happens. You know, it happened in the 60s hippie movement with let's go buy some land. And then the people who actually owned the land were the ones who ended up profiting from it over the last 40 years. And so, and now they're, you know, so, and the same things happen in farmers and just, there's just a number of different play, you know, the information superhighway of the 90s and all this. So, I mean, so now all of that is bought and owned by, you know, Amazon Web Services, and instead of being, you know, an interconnected group of so yeah, so it's I think future discussions about open source also need to take into account the inevitability of this profit motive, and build in you know, preventative or sort of measures for that, because the commercial side actually has plenty of inoculative abilities to do things like, oh, let's just get them to compromise to an BSD license, and then, you know, it's just tiny little compromises over time. You're seeing the same thing happen in Web3 as a general rule, and crypto is, you know, overall. So now you've got you know, various groups that are basically front ends for the traditional banking systems and so on. So these are all you know, verifiable patterns across time. So so I hope that the next phase of this, we will you know, consider those kinds of cultural processing things. And
So we've like talked about this kind of like seduction of the simplicity of, you know, like it's open and free and we're just going to give it away and everybody's going to sing Kumbaya. Um, but I mean, we've also touched on how that's like a naive, you know, thing that we kind of just gave up the power. And now we're looking back with 2020 and we're here and, you know, we have no power and all these companies do with the stuff that we built. Um, so like what are the other issues that have contributed to the state of open source today? And like, how do you see the state of open source today? This is an open question for all three of you.
Oh, I thought maybe Regis wanted to say something. Was unmuted there. But yeah, I'm doing this thing, right? I'm making a company that is by and large open source, but we're also trying some things with new licenses. But coupled with that, we're also trying to challenge the whole, not so much the business model, but the funding model. Because these companies, they were doing some bad stuff long before they were extracting value from open source. Before they were extracting from open source, they were extracting from anything else that they could extract from. And that is, in very short, to me at least, the way I see it, it's about this whole growth paradigm that we have gotten ourselves trapped in. And ever since the 70s, 80s, we have latched on to this idea that the virtuous way to run a company is just to seek profit above all. That is actually a correct way to do things. And I think we see pretty clearly now, like maybe I'm wrong on this, but I don't feel like there's so much to discuss any longer that this didn't work out too well. We're not doing too hot. So business as usual is actually killing us. And the way we are allowing these companies to just get bigger and bigger and bigger is also killing us. And they're killing themselves too, but they don't really care as long as they're the one left standing in the end and they can sort of claim to be the victors before it all burns down. And the funding model there is pretty messed up, right? Because we have these venture capitalists who are going around betting on 50 different companies, and they only need one of them to be successful for the outsized returns to make the other 49 actually worth it for them. And the only way that that happens is that that one unicorn that we call them is a monopoly, which is an empirically bad thing. But that is the business model, is find the company that can become a monopoly, dominate the competition, and own 60 to 80, 90% of the whole market. And this is not a pro-social way to fund innovation and development. It is not good for us. And that's why I'm a big believer in any kind of company model that is essentially people owned, employee owned, community owned, anything that prevents any minority of people having an outsized amount of ownership in the venture. And so that is also how we are running this thing is in very short, so I'll try to not rant on about this, but we're doing this thing called a steward-owned company, which means that we are going to take investment with strictly capped returns for both us as founders and for the investors. So we say we want, like, if you give us $1 million, you can at most get 3x back. You can get $3 million total over the lifetime of the company in returns on that, which means that over time, as the company hopefully is successful and does better, it is actually paying down its debts instead of the debts increasing when a company owns 10% in the whole company. And the better you do, the higher that price tag gets for actually buying back your company and then distributing ownership to everyone who is a stakeholder in it. And to me, that's a much more open source aligned model as well, because in the open source model, you want to invite as many people as possible to come and contribute to the project. And it's pretty fun to imagine this type of project where anyone who has come in and contributed to the project, let's say someone has really put in quite a few hours over the years, you can actually you have a proper record of work there just by the nature of the tools that we work with Git and so forth, and you can actually put that in the register and says, well, this entitles you to this much ownership in the company. And we have that technology now. This is not advanced stuff we're talking about, but it is just so counter traditional to the way we've done things. That is just not the venture capital way of doing things. You generally just like you work for a fixed 3 years or something, and then you like unlock the whole strict one piece of ownership that you can get. And I think that's a very outdated model. I think we are ready now for any company to actually let any worker who does spend significant time in the company, let them become a co-owner essentially of the company that they're part of.
Yeah, can I mention something about this in response? I actually wrote an article that's exactly about this, and I think that um, as admirable as your steps are, I actually think that the focus on funding is a bit misplaced in the sense that I think we should be focusing on the paradoxes that exist, and by solving for those paradoxes, we would then solve out the need for the extractiveness. So the point is that because we haven't solved those paradoxes, the only thing we're left with is kind of the default extractive position. So in order to actually solve the extractive position, I think these, among other paradoxes, are in the article that I just posted, is something that we could be focused on. That's not strictly open source, but I think if we were to pay attention to these paradoxes, we would be more open source than we were at the beginning of solving these paradoxes, or at the end of solving these paradoxes, than we would be at the beginning. So
It sounds like you're kind of touching on like there are certain like cultural dynamics and things that no matter what system is set up, these cultural dynamics may just win out. And are we solving the wrong
right.
problem by focusing on something downstream of these cultural dynamics?
Right, and it's the point is that if we think of inevitable enclosure as inevitable, then that's not really the right way to solve it. We actually have to solve these underlying paradoxes that then make the enclosure impossible, right?
What are some
And
of these paradoxes as it relates to open source that you see?
um, well, I mean, some of it's coordinating, I mean, so there's numerous ones. Speed depth is the first one. right? So if you've got somebody who's trying to iterate something so they can make money on it, they're not typically going to look too far into it, right? They're not going to, they're, if somebody's going to give them a short payout that improves their lives in some temporary way, which billionaires and multinational companies can just do with a whim to solve, that problem, then you actually have all the speed that you want. You never have to go into any depth. It's decentralization, coordination paradox, privacy, transparency. I think if we were to create systems that would actually solve for these main, and there's a bunch others that I have too, but trust and trustlessness, innovation, stability, financial incentives versus authentic engagement, and so on. I think if we were to solve for those problems, then we would have a more robust open source movement that is anti-fragile and could withstand enclosure. So
Did you have
when I was
anything?
hearing,
Oh, go ahead.
yeah, as I was listening to, both of you, one thing might be it's just 40 years into the open source movement, maybe it needs to just become more politically or socially mature, right? I mean, let's think of other places where, whether it's unionizing, whether it is creating constitutional conventions, places where people are potentially, at loggerheads with each other on how to distribute resources, how to prevent extraction. Humans have evolved lots of deliberative techniques for those purposes, right? That you think through, like if you think of how laws are made. I mean, laws are supposed to be, they are open source, right? I mean, they're meant to be transparent, and you are supposed to, at least in principle, contribute to how they are modified. But there's an enormous amount of politicking that goes into what is finally written down. And I'm wondering if those are skills that the open source movement needs to have more. So it's a how to, not what to.
yeah, that's basically what I'm trying to address by talking about paradoxes. And I'm sort of talking about paradoxes as sort of the problem statement, right? And then we also have a thing we call tunable tensegrities, which is a tensegrity model that identifies it's not always possible to solve, right? Sometimes you actually, in order to maintain the integrity of the system, you actually have to have tension. So you have to have opposing kinds of ways of doing things. And so being able to orient yourself on those things, first, you have to understand paradoxes. Second, you have to be able to identify what's a tensegrity, what's something that's simple. And so there are other tools that, you can use to diagnose those kinds of things. But getting into, again, my thing is the cultural processing. If we're not culturally processing that stuff and culturally competent at processing those things, I think we're always going to run into this, open source revolution, and then eventual enclosure, and then subsequent open source revolution and subsequent enclosure. So I'm suggesting that we evolve the entire scheme a bit, and get into preventing those things.
But for example, I'm thinking of, like, how did the enclosure movements in England in the late 18th, early 19th century, how did that happen, right? I mean, it was done for the capitalist purposes that Erlend, I think, would be quite familiar with, which is you want to get people to lose access to common resources so that then they become labor for your, emerging factories, right? And so fighting to maintain control over commons is a hugely political act, right? It's not just that. And what does that look like? What does that struggle look like for open source? I mean, is it just changing licensing requirements, or is there something which, could potentially lead to a sharper struggle?
I'm curious to hear Erlend respond to this, if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I'm just really applauding everything I'm hearing now. I love this notion of opening up everything. I think that should be one of these new roles that we as open source developers take upon ourselves, is to think far beyond just these computers and the software that's on it and start practicing openness in general in all aspects of our lives. I think we need to open up all of it, open up the financial systems, open up the banks, open up the educational institutions, open up science. It all needs to be cracked way more open because this
100%.
whole enclosure that's been happening, it's not just an economical enclosure, it's an information enclosure as well. We don't really understand the systems that govern our lives. And it just so happens that in the realm of software and the digital, we do have a pretty advanced practice at this point when it comes to openness. We just haven't really applied it a whole lot outside of software yet. But I think we have a whole lot that we could teach the general public, and of course, a lot that we can learn as well, having been quite narrowly focused on our little computers. There's a lot we can learn from society at large as well. But just in terms of this practice of opening things up and what that looks like in terms of the licenses and the methodology and what you should be looking for, what questions you should be asking about where is X in this system. That is a very, very natural next step for us as a movement if we want to integrate our knowledge and praxis with the society at large that we at least purport to be wanting to better along with our fellow human beings.
Yeah, and I've done some scholarship around the Hacker Manifesto, Mackenzie Works work, because you can tell that at the beginning of the so-called hacker movement that arose in the 60s, there was a bit of an alignment between the guru movement and the hippie movement and psychedelic movement. All of this was kind of come together, and so these people were really aware of the underpinnings and the abstracts that were actually involved in constructing this stuff. So if you read things like the Hacker Manifesto, you actually see that the fundamental definition of the term hacking in some sense is actually hacking on abstracts, right? And so hacking on abstracts is, I think, an underappreciated skill. And so when you say breaking everything wide open, I couldn't agree with you more. I just think that we often extrapolate certain technical things and turn everybody into an engineer so that they don't get too involved in this abstract hacking thing, right? And so some of the laws that exist, like against psychedelics and other things, are exist so that we don't actually end up being able to develop competence in a broader way of thinking and instead restrict ourselves. So all of that stuff, software is built on top of all these things in my view. And so, for example, when I first looked at Bitcoin, I saw somebody with an immense practical philosophy, and my training in Hinduism, Hindu thought is, both is balanced in that exact and precise way. You would never do a practical thing without an underlying philosophy, and you would never just have an empty philosophical thing that didn't have a pedagogy or something underneath it. And so for me, if I'm talking about open source, I see all this stuff, underneath it. And so I think it would be really useful to appreciate the role of philosophy. I know in proof of stake, Vitalik talks a lot about, we don't need more software developers, we need more economists and philosophers, right? And so I actually started a group called the Blockchain Philosophers just to reinforce that stuff, to kind of break open what Erlend was talking about exactly, and support people who are creating open source software with this fundamental understanding of philosophy and abstracts and what hacking was originally intended to mean. So, and I think the open source software movement was created by people who were hacking at that level, but now so many years later, I think we've forgotten the roots of it somewhat.
So we're kind of like getting into the future, the frontier of like what we should be doing, right? Like at a grand scale. And we only have about 10 minutes before I think we need to swap to questions. So yeah, just to kind of like build on where you guys are headed with the conversation. Like, I'm curious, like, is just opening everything and having, the right licenses, is that really it? Like, is that the magic bullet? Like, I don't know, maybe not. But like, what else do you guys think is needed, or what other risks are still lurking beneath, the water, even if we get those things right? And not to make this question even more complicated, but like, how do AI, Web3, all this stuff, like, how does that factor into the future of open source and where we're headed? Like, how do we deal with that? It's kind of a rat's nest of a question, but I'll just toss it over.
I don't mean to dominate the conversation, but I did. I've been working on some articles and working with AI. What I, as an autistic person, as a neurodivergent person, what I'm often talking about is being overwhelmed by sensory input, right? And so you don't get a lot of relief from that. And I think there are a lot of neurodivergent folks in our particular sort of setup, right? And what AI has done for me is to allow my output to be a lot more like the speed of my input. So I went from writing 1 million words a year to writing 7.5 million words a year, right? And so it's just vastly improved. And so internally, I actually experienced this difference now because, and one of my articles that I wrote was how similar like AI hallucinations are to the misunderstandings that neurodivergent people have about social situations. And so I'm actually having a lot of cultural thoughts about this, just because I think we go into an AI discussion in the same way we went into this idealistic thing. Oh, it's going to be great. AI is going to be able to do all this stuff for us, and then there's going to be this kind of enclosure, and the reason why multinational corporations are sitting there waiting in the wings and spending billions of dollars to get very little in return is because they know that enclosure is coming and that they're going to profit massively as a result of that. So it's hard not to be a little cynical about it, but at the same time, I personally experience a huge benefit from using it. So how does one deal with the paradox of that? I'm still wrestling with it a little bit, especially with respect to AI.
So it almost seems like, one advantage of AI, specifically for like people who, struggle to get what's in their head out, like I'm definitely one of those people, is that it could have outsized effects on their, contributions to, the governance and like contributions to the code and things of like open source to make sense of things, which is which is great. But yeah, I mean, like, curious maybe for Rajesh or Erlend, like, what are some other like risks and issues, maybe for the future? Like, if we get the license right and we open it,
Mhm.
what else?
I think AI is going to bring some more traditional forms of politics into things like software, which haven't. I mean, the material density of AI. I mean, these data centers that consume so much energy, that have such huge capital requirements. That is, I mean, then we are talking about, old Marxist type of questions about who owns the means of production. Um, Frankly, why, like, what would it even mean to have AI data centers be commonly owned? I don't even, I mean, as of today, it looks like it's going in the exact opposite direction, right? That there will be, say, two or three hyperscalers who own everything. Well, what is it going to take to break that? And so, I mean, so that's like very sharp. That's the kind of politics people used to get killed for, right? I mean, it is. I mean, people used to get shot at for saying we need to control minds, and and so, well, if data centers are the new minds, then somebody. I mean, what's the politics that's going to emerge around that? That's what interests me a lot.
Erlend, do you have anything to add here?
Yeah, I guess we're sort of doing the AI question at the end here, and
You don't have to answer that one.
no,
You can answer it however you want.
I want to.
I
It's
hate to
fun
be
because
the
it's complicated. It's very hard. I mean, AI. It has to be acknowledged that it is an inherently extractive technology, right? Both how the technology itself works by just sucking up the whole internet, including a whole lot of data that a lot of us didn't really consent to having be included in this technology that is being sold back to us, and also just because it's being monopolized by the same hyperscalers that have been ruling the universe for the past few decades. I think of AI similarly to how I think about flying. It's not a thing I love doing. I sort of have a little sting of shame every time I get on an airplane to get to some conference to meet the others. But when it's important enough, I do it. And even though I haven't really found a good use for AI personally yet, I know plenty of people who have and feel like it is bringing quite a lot to their lives. And I certainly don't begrudge them that. I just want to make sure that people don't take this utility and ignore the externalities of this technology in using it. Like you can enjoy the fact that we have cars as well and feel like cars are important. As say you're a family guy, you need that car to drive your family around, do your errands and so forth. You can still acknowledge that cars are also causing a lot of harm in the world. In the production of the car, the fumes, the microplastics from the tires, the collisions and so forth, right? And it's the same again with AI. Now, I mostly think of AI as an ownership problem. I keep coming back to the labor movement, and I really like bringing it back to the Luddites. Um, like some 200-ish years ago, we had the weavers, and they were displaced in a much similar way to a lot of people are experiencing AI in their lives now, in that they were doing this manual labor, weaving, and suddenly these machines were brought in and replaced them. And the problem there was in a factory with 100 people, say, with one owner on top, because there's a centralized ownership of the whole operation. This owner buys the machines and says, great, now I can fire half of my employees. But in a different model, where these 100 people own this company together, they can bring in the machines and say, great, now we all work 50% less. And it should be the same with AI. We bring in the AI and we say, great, now we can work less. This is the same as, I think it's Adam Smith, one of the economists, who also like theorized, like in the future, we're going to have all this technology, all these gains. So we're all going to work a whole lot less. And technically that should be possible. We know it is possible, but of course that doesn't happen because again, we don't have power. And when other people have all the power, they can say, well, I'm going to get even richer if you all keep working a whole lot more. And we have all these efficiencies through technology that enlarges the pie for myself first and foremost. Now, how that relates to open source, I think it's interesting how almost everyone in the world now has sort of had a speed run of what we've been seeing in the open source world for the past few decades of enclosure of our openly shared artifacts. We've been seeing that for quite some time. Now almost everyone has some feeling of, I don't really love the fact that that painting I shared on DeviantArt or just those posts I put up on that social network is now part of this machinery that is making the richest people in the world even richer. And I think one of the things we can use to our advantage there is that now we have common cause, both us, the hackers, the developers who are working on the systems level, and just regular folk at large who are really fed up with the system and now can kind of see a lot of the same dynamics that we've been experiencing for quite some time. And so to answer your question about is licensing enough? Absolutely not. We really have to fight for power and ownership on every level. And a lot of that comes down to taking fights that go way beyond software and tech, even in general. And it's much more about unions and challenging the economical system that we're all trapped in and getting engaged in politics and being more of an activist. Like, I think a final note for me would just be that I would love to see the average developer get in touch with their inner activist and figure out what that looks like for them, both in the digital sphere, but also in the physical sphere, which can be quite eye-opening for a lot of us, myself included. In the past few years, I've gotten much more engaged on the local level of politics and activism here in Norway after a too long of a stretch just living in the digital, and it's a good time to be out there with actual people, shaking their hands and hugging them and seeing their smiles when you're sharing good ideas together and feel that energy of we can do at least something here. We can get something started. And I hope that more people in the digital sphere take it upon themselves to actually act because we do have power. We just need to reach out to the others and ask, like, are you fed up with this nonsense as well? Okay, great. Then let's do something about it. Maybe we don't have all the answers yet, but we can all agree that what's going on is not okay and it needs to change.
Yeah. The power that we have is with each other. Like that's how we have the most power is through coordination. And it's a tough thing to do, but yeah, I love that point. Before we move to questions, I don't know, Rajesh or Regis, if either of you have a brief finishing thought. If not, that's okay. I have some questions here, but I'll let.
I put my closing thoughts in there. The book that I'm writing now is basically about colonization and decolonization and how they work and how they actually function. And so I do think we just need to understand that between individuals and the systems that are set up, there is a cultural context that we all collaboratively somehow agree to. And by disagreeing with an extractive setup or a colonized setup and getting together collectively to improve that culture, then it's natural that different financial and other kinds of systems would be birthed from that. It's not necessarily that it would be open source, but I think it would be the best version of what open source is actually supposed to be. In the way that I think about it. So I'm hopeful that we can get there, and I'm grateful to everybody who is kind of resisting the colonized cultural context in whatever way they know how.
Anything from you, Rajesh? I think you're on mute.
I was just going to say, I'm channeling Ronan's point in the chat window. I mean, I think if we see open source as a coordination mechanism, so not think of it as so sacred that it cannot be questioned. I mean, so you have market mechanisms, you have open source mechanisms, you have many others, and learning how to design good coordination mechanisms seems like the skill to develop, right? And that's inherently political. It's not going to be just writing a protocol and assuming that people will adopt it. I think so. So how do we? What's the politics of coordination?
Awesome. Yeah. Great points all around. I'm going to shift to the questions now. Pretty much all of them are around licenses. No surprise there, since that seems to be our only lever of control in open source, at least, the main one. So let's see. We have one from Jeremy, and one from Tynan. Well, let's see. Tynan says, I'll ask the difficult question, which license should I be using for my community projects?
Um, I would have to, well, if I'm gonna answer it, I would have to know a lot more about what is the project because there's certainly not like the one license
It
that
depends.
works for everything. So yeah, sadly it does depend. But these days, when it comes to, for instance, just to take an example, when it comes to an end user application, it generally comes down to two different choices for me. One is a license, technically a collection of licenses called the Polyform license. And that has a very, very simple license that actually is now coming out in a V2 version as well with the Polyform non-commercial license. And this whole collection of Polyform licenses is actually the software equivalent of the Creative Commons licenses that we are all very used to when you share a piece of art and it'll say like CC by SA. And that is the kind of license that in the art community is super popular and super common, whereas in software, hopefully now that's gonna change, but until recently we've had a lot of resistance against that type of license because that's not technically open source according to the open source definition by the OSI. And I think we're seeing now that people are more open to experimentation, and I think that's a great thing. Now, that's the one license is Polyform non-commercial. The other one is the FSL license, the functional source license, which is the license that the people at Sentry, the analytics logging software company, put together when they had that exact same problem that a lot of these companies have, that they started out more permissively open source and realized this is not sustainable. The hyperscalers are coming after us. We need some sort of limitation here. And so that license tries to be a little more nuanced than the Polyform non-commercial license, which effectively just says the Polyform non-commercial license says if you use this thing commercially, you have to come to us for a license. Now you can still kind of add some language to that if you want, but the functional source license essentially just says instead, you are free to do whatever with this source code, much exactly like you do with any other permissive software, except if you compete directly with our software product, with our service that we run with this software. You're not allowed to just replicate that and run your own service. And what's great, of course, with that particular license is you kind of also, by adopting it, get the backing of the Sentry institution and their lawyers are going to be on standby to take the case if someone oversteps with the FSL license. Whereas the Polyform one, that's backed by a guy named Carl Mitchell, and I forget the name of his essentially colleague there, but he's also a very renowned open source lawyer. So that also does have like good backing, but not as much sort of financial support behind it. So like usually the easiest one right now, I would say, would be the FSL. That's like a good starting point, even just to start figuring out what these alternative licenses look like. I would start with the FSL.
So we have other questions here, but I don't want to cut off Rajesh or Regis if you have anything to add to this one. All
I
right.
don't.
So yeah, Jeremy has a good one. And it's very related to the last one, which is what kind of license clauses prevent corporate extraction while still being open to peers and small businesses? And the second part is how exactly can we discriminate technically in the words of the license without keeping out people we don't want to and without letting in the people we don't want to? So this is a question of openness and of boundaries as it pertains to licenses. Like it seems like there's a balancing beam here between keeping, protecting people from getting in while also allowing in the people that you want in and not keeping them out. So does anyone have any uh, thoughts here?
Well, I certainly have thoughts, but if Regis or Rajesh wants to,
Yeah, if
well,
Regis or Rajesh, you want to answer more on like like a theory level or like however you want to answer it, like please chime in.
I think For me, being epistemically and ontologically flexible is a primary thing. And I feel like the moment, like this side discussion we're having about government, like government is not epistemically and ontologically flexible. It's quite literally becoming less and less and less epistemically and ontologically flexible over time. And so, you know, how can we create systems that are not subject to that kind of ossification is a major question for me, um, because there's no way I can go into government and say, okay, government, you have to use a GPL license. So when I say GPL, I'm being specifically subversive here. I don't really care about your government situation. And I want to create something which makes a demand upon all systems to adhere to it in a way that subverts that kind of ossification. And so my point is that by saying GPL, I'm my entire approach to all of this is fundamentally subversive. So I just feel like being subversive is always going to be subversive of orthodoxy and an overly inflexible situation. And what Tynan's talking about is there's a huge asymmetry. And so orthodoxies deal in asymmetries. The currency of orthodoxy is to ensure asymmetry of information and data and power and every other kind of thing. And so that's the war we're really fighting in some senses is against asymmetry. And so, if I look at my own definition of decolonization is fundamentally contextualizing, whereas colonization is fundamentally decontextualizing. And so that tensegrity fight, the fight, to keep that balance is the fight that I think we're all engaged in open source and elsewhere. And so I think if we're just talking about oversimplifying it to licenses, that's a bit of a meaningless argument. But at the same time, I think we need to fight it at every level. Like what Churchill said, we'll fight them in the beaches and the forests and in the whatever. Like we need to do that. Do you know what I mean? So
A good
so
rallying
yeah,
cry.
Yeah, I definitely. Oh, did you want to jump in, Josh?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I
I'll go after you.
so I very much second that. And speaking of being subversive, the cool thing with licenses that a lot of people don't really realize is you can really just make it up. You can draft your own license if you so wish, and a lot of people have done so, and quite often intentionally as an activist action. That's for instance, I think it's the 966 or 996 something license in China, for instance, that was made to sort of protest against the overwork practices there. We have the Hippocratic license that essentially says if you do things unethically, you're not allowed to use this software. And a lot of these licenses are not legally tested, but that's not even really the point. And also because our licensing sphere now is so standardized, there's enough inertia in the system that most corporations, even just by having any kind of custom license at all, that's already all the protection you need from a corporation, because they are not going to want to use software that has a custom weird license that says like Bob's license. But to specifically this question of how do you sort of draw the right boundary? Well, on the one hand, yes, there are also like existing licenses that try to do exactly this, to say like big corporations, no, small companies, yes. And this is even common practice in, for instance, game development. The Unreal Engine, I think maybe the Unity engine has done this, maybe they still do. They go a bit back and forth, but it's pretty common practice for game engines to say this is freely available up to a point of revenue. Like once you're making 1 million a year, 10 million a year using this software, now you have to pay us. But in the meantime, we just want this to be free because that's a great distribution model for us. And I think more software could follow that model to say, this is free for anyone at a certain scale, but past that, let's talk about buying a license to be allowed to use this stuff.
All right. Let me say, I'm going to say something super theoretical, um, and maybe provocative, that first we need to think beyond the license, right? What we need a better understanding of the kind of harms that are being done. So, for example, we say extraction, or we say, you know, your property rights are being not being respected, or you're being treated, you're not being given credit. But I think we need a very sophisticated idea of exactly what is the legal and epistemic status of a piece of software or any other thing that you are planning to put out into the world, right? What does harm mean when, if it's misused? Because any kind of commons, when you're trying to draw a boundary, I don't think it can be legislated in the abstract. It's always negotiated, right? Like, do I have the right to bring my cow to this meadow or not? Have you shared your cow's milk with others? I mean, like, there are all these kind of things, and I think in the physical world community, I mean, Eleanor Ostrom got a Nobel Prize for showing how communities are very sophisticated in how they manage these kind of common resources, and I think we need to bring that, and to theorize. I mean, to be there's this whole argument going on that the US is a lawyer state while China is an engineering state. Dan Wang and others have written about it. But I actually don't, I think we need a bit more of the lawyer's perspective when it comes to open source. And common law, I think, gives us a lot of tools.
Can I just build on Rajesh's point here? A huge part of my research has been on taking Betty Martin's Wheel of Consent and operationalizing it into Web3 and crypto context, so that we can programmatically understand how consent will work. And so she's got a very nice model called the Wheel of Consent, and I'm really interested in operationalizing that and it could apply to licenses as much as it could to DAO operations or tokenomics or any number of other things. But I think having a really clear and open source, or like free vision of how to operationalize these sort of principles of consent, which were originally applied to sort of physical touch and other stuff. But it's such a great model, and I think we could figure out a way to programmatically. So I'm still looking for people to help with that side of the project, but it was an obvious implication of what I think Rajesh was talking about, if I didn't misunderstand your point.
Thanks.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on one thing too. Like, I appreciated Rajesh pushing on, like, we got to think, outside the license, and that's been a common theme throughout the call, because I mean, there are these kind of like hidden dynamics and paradoxes that result in the issues that occur, right? And like, if we don't properly think about them and explore them and um, try to consider how to deal with them at the root, they're just going to keep rearing their ugly head. And I mean, licenses appears to be a way to to think about those things and embed them in something that's legally enforceable, which is great. But yeah, I mean, I wish we had another hour to just explore all of these like paradoxes and things to consider, right? Like consent and boundaries and you know extraction versus regenerative, like things like abundance and all of that. But yeah, not enough time. But yeah, keep going. We have 5 more minutes.
Just to add a quick point to what Rajesh was putting out here, which I think is great. Like, yeah, we definitely want to move beyond the licenses. And a great example of that, I think, in fairly recent memory, was the introduction of codes of conduct as a pretty standard document that followed any project on GitHub and Git repositories in general. There was a bit of pushback on that in the beginning. A lot of people, sort of our libertarian side showed itself, and then some of us started going kind of like, technology and open source, it should be neutral, right? Like, let's stay non-political. And I think by now it's pretty clear, like we've all mostly agreed that that's just not possible, and that also has never been the case. Technology, and especially open source, very much is political and has been political since the very start. And having things like a code of conduct be a standardized part of open source practice is great. That adds to our social codes that should just be deeply integrated in our way of working together. And the fact that we went this far without a code of conduct being a standard piece of every open source project, I think we'll look back on that and laugh before long, and think that was pretty silly of us to not think that our social norms should be very much part of the fabric of yeah, well, everything that we're working on together. Like it's about so much more than just the computer code. So when this was suddenly standardized, like now it's just not a subject any longer. Now it's just a presumed thing that when you have a new project and it's been around for a little while, people start asking questions. If there's no code of conduct here, they start wondering like, so what are the rules of engagement here? Like, yeah, how do you run your community, right? Because the absence of it at this point is strange to us because now we don't know what kind of project really is this. Yeah.
With about 3 minutes left, yeah, any other thoughts here? Codes of conduct and the like?
I'm struck by how important boundaries are. And I think one of the major issues when we start at something is if we go into it with this idealism, one of the sort of blind spots or shadow aspects of what we're dealing with is we forget about boundaries because we're just so enthusiastic about what we're starting. And so I think having a like um, non-utopian approach to starting things, like how does one actually start some kind of open source project in such a way that has a realistic chance of having some longevity rather than this, if we just build it fast is the only option that we've ever thought of instead of building it in such a way that it will structurally tend to guarantee longevity. And so if we can flip our thinking about just build it fast and extract money and get, it's like the fast thing is like an extraction problem. And that's why I list the speed depth paradox at the top of my list, is because it just has so many different kinds of implications for how we deal with things. And so I'm going to encourage everybody who's listening to the call now or in the future to try to think about how to build things that last, and instead of things that just are built quickly.
Yeah, there's like I heard something years ago. It was like the difference between a startup and a stay up, which sounds like what you were describing, Erlend, like a stay up, something that's designed to not collapse with time. Um, but yeah, and one other thing I wanted to flag here was really something Kristen said in the chat, which I think is really important. Boundaries aren't walls, they're membranes. They're permeable. It's really, yeah, super
Yeah,
interesting. Where like everything is a cell basically, right? It's got its own little
yeah.
membrane bubble.
Well, and if you actually look at the operation of some of the simplest cells in existence, I remember I looked at a map of one in a biochemistry textbook one time, and they were mapping just the membrane interactions had 164 different types of interactions. It was just mind-boggling that just this tiniest part of the tiniest part of my body had this absolutely enormous complexity and nuance to what we're doing. And I think the way that we've been educated in other ways, I think we don't often start thinking about things with that kind of nuance and complexity. I think complexity and thinking with complexity and nuance is our birthright, and I think educationally we need to re-empower people to think with nuance and complexity. Otherwise, I don't know that we're going to be able to achieve the kind of minimum viable cultural push that it's going to take to actually achieve some of these ideals
Yeah,
in the open source.
it's a great closing thought. Thank you all. Really appreciate it. It was a great discussion. Wish we could have gone on longer, but maybe we'll do it again. I'm going to
Thanks,
pass it
Gabriel,
back
for being a
to,
great host.
yeah, no problem. My pleasure.
Yeah,
I'm going
that
to
was
pass it back
amazing.
to Kristen. Thanks.
Thank you, Kristen.
Thank you. This is great.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. This has been amazing. So, thank you. I'll just give a little shout out to everyone who was on the panel. Thank you, Gabriel, for facilitating. That was masterful. Rajesh, Erlend, Regis, really delightful listening to you. It's interesting always as like being on the sidelines where kind of ambiently listening and then also like doing a bunch of things, but a lot of the like core themes, they're like resonant in the air. So it's like I don't even have to be just sitting and watching to capture some of like the enclosure stuff, the boundary stuff. Like all of that is so fascinating and so it's philosophical versus technical, which I love. So I really enjoyed the conversation from my perspective as well. And to the audience, I mean, it's not really an audience. I guess it's like pop-up community almost. The chat has been popping off the entire time. I think, captured, Artem just shared another link. I think I've captured all the links and I'm going to share now. We have a little Notion document where those links live. And also we pulled together a couple of resources from the panelists themselves. And I also pulled in the images that we had. So that's all there. I've got a few other things from the Scenius. So if you did want to follow along on our journey, please do. We don't publish too often, but it's a good way to tag along. So yeah, with that, thank you. Very enjoyable. And let's do it again sometime. All right, folks.
Yeah, thanks to all the panelists and everybody who set this up. You guys were awesome.
Our pleasure.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Lovely. Take care, everyone.